Good morning, and a very literally warm welcome to everyone joining us here today for the launch of the UK National Consultation Group for the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I'm Rhian-Mari Thomas, I'm CEO of the Green Finance Institute, and I was delighted to be a co-chair of the informal working group that worked with many of you on the TNFD in preparation for its launch. We're very proud, therefore, that the Institute is hosting the secretariat for the TNFD and also, as of today, acting as the convener for the UK National Consultation Group. As many of you know, the TNFD is currently in the design and development phase of its work. It's building and testing a risk management and disclosure framework for nature-related risks and opportunities with market participants at its core. And it's our role as the convener of the UK National Consultation Group, or NCG, because where would we be if we didn't have another acronym, to understand national concerns around nature-related risks and opportunities. We're going to be socialising the draft TNFD framework across the UK, and importantly, we're set up to get your feedback on the draft framework to ensure the final framework can be readily applied by organisations in the UK. With those aims in mind, we'll be engaging with you whether you're from financial institutions, corporates, civil society organisations, local communities or public sector institutions. And today's event is about providing you with all the information you need to be able to engage and to hear how we can best support you. Over the next 75 minutes, we're going to hear from the co-founder of the TNFD and Vice Chair of the Stewardship Council, Andrew Mitchell, who will remind us why the TNFD is so important and why it was established. And then David Craig, our highly energetic and engaged co-chair of the TNFD, will then be tackling the what, sharing where the TNFD is on its journey, how it's working with businesses and financial institutions, and also bringing us up to date on the latest beta release, one of which was 2 weeks ago. David will then be chairing a conversation with UK representatives who are at different stages of testing the framework so we can hear how that process is being adopted, and there will also be an opportunity to ask questions. And finally, my colleague Helen Avery, who heads up the Institute's nature programmes, will be sharing the next steps of the NCG and how you can engage with us. A reminder to us all that this is being recorded, and a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. With that, over to you, Andrew.
Well, hello. Hello, everybody. And it's Andrew Mitchell to talk to you a bit why nature now, why all this matters. But first, I want to say a big thank you to Rhian-Mari for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. And I'm super excited about the start of this consultation group for the UK. Very, very exciting and an important step for the TNFD. But if you go back a few years, we were thinking, you know, the TCFD is pretty good, and I expect most of you are busy worrying about climate, but that's really the first step on this journey to bring what had regarded as externalities in the economy a little bit more on board, and to understand not just the E of ESG in terms of climate, but in everything else. That means water, landscapes, forests, and oceans. So a number of years ago, I thought, you know, maybe we should have a twin to the TCFD. And if we could work that with a Paris Agreement for nature, it might have the same kind of impact as the combination of the TCFD and the Paris Agreement on climate has had to wake everybody up and get moving on climate. But, you know, why does nature really matter? Well, let me tell you, this is not about butterflies and bees. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about big infrastructure, like what you see in the picture behind me. I'm a conservationist. I've been working at the front line of nature and conservation all my life. But now I seem to be hugging asset managers and bankers more than trees, because you realize it's all about the flow of money. We have to change the movement of money fundamentally, or we will continue to finance ourselves into extinction. And that's not easy to do. We need to move from nature negative money towards nature positive money. And why? Well, I used to work up in the canopies of those rainforests you see behind me, and you realize that's where life meets the atmosphere. And what we're effectively doing is burning out the lining of our lungs around the world. That infrastructure is being collapsed. So it's not just the butterflies and bees. See nature as infrastructure that is keeping the earth safe. Remember this, billions of years ago, there was 95% CO2 in the atmosphere. How much is in the atmosphere today? Well, it's 0.04%. And it wasn't a carbon capture and storage machine that took all that carbon out of the atmosphere. It was trees and plankton that did it, natural processes that have got us to this steady state. And we're mucking that about, not only by polluting the atmosphere, but also tearing down this infrastructure right across the world. Half of life has been lost in just the last 40 years. Yet we hear, according to the World Economic Forum, that half of our GDP depends on nature. Well, what's going to happen? Those ecosystem services are going to undermine our economy unless we look after them, because we'll lose them. And part of the problem is that in our financial systems, we've got the wrong kind of dashboard. When you're looking on your terminals at all that data and making decisions about what you invest or lend to, often the impact on nature is not there. And the impact on your enterprise value is not there either if you ignore it. So what we need to do is bring new kinds of data into that dashboard and at least start to make nature visible, just as we are doing with climate. Of course, not easy at the moment. We don't have a target for nature like 1.5 degrees. We don't have a currency for nature like a ton of CO2. And that's why we need the TNFD. And of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity is trying to come up with the targets and some of the metrics that we need in the same way as we now have them for climate. These will come. People are working on it, and there's lots of technology out there beginning to be brought to bear on understanding how nature is changing. It's not that we've got not enough data, we've got the wrong kind of data. There's lots of data on nature and how it's going up or down, whether it's on land or the oceans. The problem is it's not designed for use by an asset manager or a banker. So we've got to turn that data and translate it into something which is usable. That's why we thought the TNFD would be really helpful in this regard. And so a few years ago, some of us started putting together the ideas with the World Wildlife Fund, UNDP, UNEP-FI, and my research group in Oxford, Global Canopy. And I have to say here, a big shout out for the UK government, because very early on they got the message, especially in DEFRA, and they helped us not only create political momentum, but also managed to bring Treasury on board in the UK, and crucially, when we came to launch the TNFD, provided considerable financial support, along with other governments and some philanthropy around the world. So we're extremely pleased that they were able to do that. And so we have started to put together the idea of the TNFD a few years ago. We had an informal working group. A lot of bright minds got together, and it was finally launched in September last year. And just in time, because this is real. Don't think for a minute that nature is something you can leave. Nature can't wait. The interplay between nature and climate is very important too. And we're already seeing, for instance, in northern Italy, 30% of farmland really at risk because of drought. We're concerned about the invisible things as well. Things like microbes in the soil, plankton in the oceans. Plankton in the oceans suck carbon out of the atmosphere. If we over-acidify the ocean or put too much plastic there, how could that change it? If we put too much fertilizer or pesticide on British farmland, how is that going to affect our ability to feed ourselves in the future? These are the systemic creeping risks that TNFD is going to be looking at. And so also it's important, lastly, to think about opportunity. This is a massive opportunity. We have a giant finance sector in Britain. Our impact is global. It's not just about what goes on in England, Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. This is a global thing. We need to think about imported risk, but exported opportunity as well, because of lending towards the right thing, differentiated lending, and investing in the right kinds of companies. You think about in the past, renewable energy was really the big upside of the climate risk thing. Well, perhaps in nature, it's going to be what I call renewable food. Our food system is going to have to change because that's the big driver of nature loss. It's not just about farmers, it's the entire chain, of course. So there are huge opportunities for change here, but we need a guidebook. And that guidebook is going to be TNFD. So I'm going to hand over to David Craig, who's one of the two co-chairs, who are wonderfully leading this whole process, who'll tell you more about it. And of course, the other co-chair is Elizabeth Rhian-Mari, who leads the Convention on Biological Diversity as its chief executive. And so the two of them, we have nature, natural capital, and financial capital working together. David, tell us how it's all going to work.
Well, very good morning, everyone. It's fantastic. So many people have joined this call to launch the National Consultation Group for the UK. And thank you very much, Andrew, for your fantastic energy of your introduction. And it's always good to hear the background and the context of why did we believe the TNFD was so important. Thank you too for Rhian-Mari for the support of TNFD through the secretariat and also the support of the National Consultation Group. So I'm David Craig. Despite the ocean behind me, I'm actually calling in from the City of London this morning, and I spent 30 years in finance and technology. Most recently, I was the CEO of Refinitiv, one of the largest data providers into the financial markets. And I'm a huge believer that financial markets, when they're equipped with the right data, the right insight, can redirect financial flows to positive outcomes, and they can help address the issues that we have in the world and the crises that we have in the world. And we really do have a crisis right now. As Andrew was saying, this is not long-term, out there, many years away. This is not theoretical. This is lack of water. This is droughts. This is the impacts of climate change happening on our natural system, in addition to the degradation that our economic activity is having on the natural system as well. And the challenge we have as a financial system for all of those who are in the financial system, as we know, is that we've valued natural assets for free for the last 150 years. What the TNFD, as Andrew says, is really trying to do is ensure that we've got a guidebook, a framework where we can redirect financial flows to nature positive outcomes. We can understand, assess, we can manage the risks of nature and nature degradation and biodiversity in our investment portfolios, in our operations, and we can do that in a globally consistent way. So building off the fantastic work of the TCFD, the TNFD has been shamelessly reusing the framework as much as we possibly can, but we've also been recognizing that whilst climate and nature are two sides of the same coin, there are some very specific and important differences when you look at nature risk versus climate risk. For example, the importance of location specificity, which all of you who've seen the first release of TNFD will see was in our framework. In a moment, we have a fantastic panel of participants that I will introduce. But just before that, I wanted to say a couple of words on the process for TNFD. How is this working and how will the national consultation groups actually work? So as Andrew said, TNFD was formed with our membership back in October last year. We now have over 550 members. It's growing by about 100 a month around the world, and it represents over 100 countries of participation. This is not a Northern Hemisphere issue. This is not an issue for New York, London, or Frankfurt. This is a global issue. And importantly, it's an issue in the global South where lots of our natural resources are so present and so important. So we have over 550 members of the Taskforce. These are corporates across sector. These are asset owners, asset managers, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. These are regulators, standards bodies. And importantly, it's the scientific community as well. We have 16 knowledge partnerships. We said right from the outset, in fact, one of the principles that was so well laid out in the informal working group was that we would be market driven. We would be designed by the market, but we'd be scientifically informed. And one of the big challenges of the TNFD is how to really get your head around the complexity of nature and the natural system, but also make this practical. Address the learning curve that is there between nature, make sure that we don't have thousands of metrics, but we have a few metrics that really matter. Because the work of the TNFD is only going to help the environment and help manage risk if this is adopted. And so this is where the national consultation groups really support and really help. We now have 6 national consultation groups, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Netherlands, India, and of course the UK. And these are really where we bring together a body of people who can look at the TNFD framework, who can understand the implications, who can give feedback and input, and really help build the learning and adoption curve that we're going to need for this to be into production into 2023 and 2024, which is our ambition. We've made our first release back in March, which was 0.1. We laid out a definition of nature, our 4 realms, the 34 biomes. And we also introduced the LEAP framework, the how-to guide, if you like, for how to assess nature risk, how to really tackle the complexity that's there and go through a step-by-step process that could be done. And I have to thank our 34 task force members, because many of them actually brought forward the knowledge of what they do today into that lead process to codify, if you like, best practice of what we're doing. There were many other things in 0.1 release, but in 0.2 release just 2 weeks ago, we released the first set of illustrative assessment metrics. So from that wide body of metrics that are out there, what are the ones that really matter and that really count, and how could they be used for the assessment process? We very clearly separated assessment versus disclosure. I think that's a confusion the market often has, that whilst there might be several thousand metrics out there to analyze the state of the ecosystem or your dependencies or impacts across those ecosystems, we obviously can't disclose everything. We would confuse and overwhelm the financial market. So in November later this year, we will put our first proposal forward of our disclosure metrics. What are the few things that really count and that really matter? As I said, we're member driven and informed by science. We have a fantastic group of 34 Taskforce members with over 18 trillion assets under management, some fantastic leaders in this field who are rolling up their sleeves, literally working weekends and nights to work on designing these releases and this framework. And we're taking a very iterative approach. We've decided not to spend 2 years writing huge long papers, but actually to create something more software focused, creating faster, more iterative releases. They're available online in interactive versions on our website. We get feedback very quickly from across the market. We've had thousands of people across the world give us feedback that we then quickly incorporate into our next release. And this is where we see the national consultation groups, and importantly, the UK National Consultation Group, contributing and helping to the feedback that we need to create something that when we do release in September 2023, our production version, isn't brand new, is well thought through, has a learning curve, has pilot test cases, has the illustrations that this is doable and manageable for the market. So that's the goal. It's a risk management and opportunities framework that is designed to help redirect financial flows into nature positive outcomes. Now what I want to do is turn over to some real practitioners in the market. We're very lucky today to have 4 members of the TNFD who are joining us today with a lot of experience in this field, in climate and now in nature. So if I can ask them to turn their cameras on and I'll introduce them. Now, we are going to make this interactive. So if I can ask people on the call, if you want to raise a question, there is a Q&A button and you can use that to raise questions for the panel. I'll try and pick them up as we go through. We'll try and take them at the end. But please do that because we want to make this very interactive. I'm going to introduce our panel now. So we first have Chris Dodwell. Chris has a long track record of public policy, having worked in the UK government on international climate policy. He is now the head of policy advocacy at Impacts Asset Management. So welcome, Chris. We have Annabelle Nelson, who is the head of ESG policy and disclosure at M&G, the asset manager. We have Supriya Sobti, the climate and purpose lead, as well as the TCFD implementation lead at NatWest Group. So it's going to be very interesting to talk about TCFD to TNFD. And then last and certainly not least, we have Leo Murphy, who's the impact manager at Climate Asset Management, which is the joint venture between HSBC and Pollination. So thank you everyone for joining me this morning and welcome to the panel. I'm going to turn to you first, Chris. You've got a long track record of public policy. I think those who know Impacts will know it well for having many years of experience in the field of sustainability, but it's not the most well-known asset manager in the world. But I think people would be very curious to just tell us more about the strategy of Impacts. How are you taking both climate and nature into account as you form the strategy going forward and as nature becomes a far more important consideration to take on board? Chris.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real privilege to take part in this launch event. So yeah, so Impacts has a 20-year track record. Actually been working in the sector about as long as I have. So we are special in that we are an asset manager that is wholly focused on opportunity, investing in companies that are well positioned to benefit from the transition to the sustainable economy. So what I mean by that, David, is that we are basically managing pension money, institutional investor money, that is looking for risk-adjusted returns and outperformance against the market. But we come into this with a very firm conviction that these sectors that are providing solutions to environmental and sustainability problems are going to grow faster than the rest of the economy. And that track record has allowed us to grow very rapidly, especially over the last 5 years or so. We're now managing $50 billion US dollars worth of assets under management. As I say, it's mostly institutional investors. We have teams in Europe, the US, and Asia looking for those investment opportunities. And they are in either thematic strategies that are focused on environmental solutions, water, sustainable food, and climate, or they are cross-cutting strategies that look at companies within the broader economy that, as I say, are well positioned to benefit from the transition. So the way that Impacts actually incorporates nature and biodiversity into our investment strategy is in 4 different ways. So firstly, in the development of our investment universe, we've always been thinking around how we can kind of find those solution providers. So there are we've been investing for some time in areas that are well aligned to natural capital solutions like clean energy, water treatment and infrastructure, pollution control, waste management, resource efficiency. But we've increasingly looked over the last couple of years at things that are really addressing the main drivers of biodiversity loss. So we took the Intergovernmental panel on biological and ecosystem services kind of taxonomy of those drivers. So effectively looking at things that would address land use change, would address climate, pollution, invasive species. And we've actually found some really interesting examples there through a taxonomy we developed that kind of are dealing with things like ballast water treatment, alternative feeds and proteins, resource efficiency, and even things that are perhaps even addressing invasive species. So the kind of the prompt that's come from the nature emergency is actually allowing us to see more investment opportunities. I think we're still looking for things that are regenerative. There's a lack of opportunities there in listed equity markets, but there's quite a lot can be done around halting biodiversity loss. So the second area that we focus on is in our company level ESG analysis. So we look at the risk exposure of companies that we are investing in, and we certainly would screen people out if they were contributing, say, deforestation loss. But what's been really interesting is we're just enhancing that process at the moment, and we're giving a specific scoring to climate risk, which has actually been driven by the data availability following TCFD implementation. That wasn't there. We're now able to give a sort of weighting to that, and we would certainly plan on incorporating a more specific weighting to biodiversity loss once TNFD starts to make that information more available. The third thing that we do is engagement with investee companies. So we led on engagement with Nike for the PRI deforestation commitment, which allowed us to get a really good feel for their engagement with deforestation in cattle, soy, palm supply chains. And in particular there, it was around the leather supply chain. So by doing that kind of engagement, you identify the priority sectors, and then you work with them to help them develop plans to kind of mitigate their outcome. And then the last thing we're doing is around advocacy. So we've been really involved in a number of the COP initiatives, around COP26 initiatives, that is, around deforestation in particular, which is leading some really interesting policy aspects. I might maybe get a chance to talk about that. But that's really been, we think there's a real driver there around policy development and around collective engagement. So that's 4 things we're doing: investment opportunities, ESG analysis, engagement with companies, and a much more active role in trying to drive public policy.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, it's interesting just listening to how you speak, because you talk about engagement a lot, and something I try and explain to people about TNFD is not just about a set of disclosures, and unfortunately we have a big D in our name. It's really about an engagement risk management approach about where your investments are and what the management teams are participating in. I do want to quickly follow up on public policy. You've got obviously a long track record in this area, having led the climate policy work of the UK. What are the things on public policy that the UK in particular could do? You mentioned, for example, alternative protein. There's a lot of discussion around this at the moment. Are there things that the National Consultation Group can do to help show governments some different approaches, some different policies that could be taken?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I did when I got involved with the informal working group, working with Rhian on TNFD, was go and look at the international sort of frameworks and the local frameworks. And I was really shocked at the fact that it was quite hard to get the investors to care that much about some of the biodiversity policies that were coming out. They just didn't, it seemed they were so detached from actual real sort of things that are likely to invest in, to affect markets. So I think there's a really clear role for stronger signaling around what the goals are, what strategic priorities are, and then how they're going to kind of affect individual investments. We put a paper out earlier this year that were trying to kind of identify how biodiversity policy needed to build on climate, but also recognize the differences. So the first thing I think we need to do is we've got to break down the problem. I talked earlier on about the different drivers of biodiversity loss, and actually they're going to need different policy responses. So I think it would really help if we were much clearer around what we're trying to achieve. So breaking this down into sort of biodiversity or nature imperatives, or looking at sectoral policies. The second one is, I think we need to recognize the distinction between the international but also the local. So it's like a multi-local approach that we need to take, but we also need to demonstrate that there's consensus in the international process. And I think that's where the UK's efforts within the CBD negotiations could really help. A strong signal that the international community is basically signed up to halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030 is really powerful to show there's consensus. But you'll then probably have to work with a mix of supplier and consumer countries. And I think the last thing then is looking at the UK. I think what we need to be doing is, what's really exciting is that a lot of the policymakers I was working on with climate back in the 2000s have now actually gravitated to nature. So DEFRA's a real hothouse for kind of innovation at the moment. And I think that we're going to come up with some really interesting policies in farming, in land management. I think that the consultation group provides a great opportunity to engage with those as they develop, and really to ensure that an investor, certainly not just a corporate, but also an investor voice is part of that, so that we can understand around where change is going to come and that the policies are there to kind of support that change. And one last thought is there's clearly an international element to this. So the rules and regulations we have around supply chains, due diligence in those, and I think the UK should be applauded for setting up the FACT dialogue, the food and agricultural commodity trade dialogue last year as part of the COP. I think that offers a real opportunity to drive change around where we're sourcing our products and to ensure that they are done in a nature positive way.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. I think you're pointing out there, how does public policy help make some of these changes investable? One of the challenges the financial market has is a lot of these new areas are not that investable yet. So I think there's a real opportunity to, through the National Consultation Group, to do that. And thank you too. Impacts were very, very influential and a strong contributor to the informal working group. So you've had a 3-year history of a TNFD. So I want to just call out the contribution that you've made to the TNFD. I'm here now to Annabelle. Annabelle, it's probably fair to say, although I'm sure you'll challenge me on this, M&G is slightly newer into this field than Impacts, who will claim 20 years experience. But that said, there's a lot of work going on at M&G. The question for you is, are you starting to see the join between climate and nature? Are you taking a more integrated approach? How is M&G looking at that and the work of the TNFD?
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. Yes, I think it's fair to say that we certainly see that climate is one element of a very complex planetary system which regulates our world. And we're very aware that effective action to address climate and biodiversity needs systems thinking. We really need to think about this holistically. And when we started to look at it, the thing that struck us is our global economy currently requires about 1.7 Earths to provide the resources we need and to absorb our waste. So the changes that are needed to move our economy to operate within the resources of the one Earth we actually have are going to be profound. And M&G, we're a global savings and investment company. We're actually both an asset manager and an asset owner. And we have around 370 billion pounds of assets under management. And as a global investor, we pretty much invest in all asset classes, sectors, and geographies. So if we recognize, which we do, that this presents climate and nature degradation, biodiversity loss, represents big systemic risks. It's big systemic risks for all of our investments, and it's big systemic risks for everyone. But we're also very mindful that there's a massive social dimension here too, because sadly it tends to be the poorest who are currently being hit hardest by climate change, who are experiencing the real stress of water insecurity and the vulnerability of food. So, I mean, Andrew mentioned it before, Chris, I've been in other conversations, has mentioned it as well. You know, there's a real imperative that the transition of our global economy needs to be a just one, where the costs and benefits are shared equally, both across communities and regions, but crucially across generations as well. So when we're looking about sustainability as a sustainable investor, when we're trying to kind of approach our investments that way, we're trying to address both the people and the planet. It has to be done in conjunction. So I think, David, you're right to say we're at an early stage in our journey. And I'd say that there are three key elements to the work we're doing so far. Firstly, and this is probably the big one, is we're really trying to build our understanding of environmental risks and the interplay with social issues. So we're undertaking thematic research. We already have built into our proprietary ESG scorecards. You know, we use the SASB's materiality map. So where an issue is material to a company in some of the sectors that we assess the ecological impacts across three lenses. So the current impact, and over the long term, the financial materiality, and also the controversy. The second big piece of work, and this is actually, as I say, as is at an early stage, is we're starting to develop a high-level biodiversity materiality heat map. And this is helping us to identify the risk hotspots and the key themes across sectors and geographies. So we've kind of started by plotting some overarching biodiversity themes, so deforestation, land use degradation, water availability and stress, freshwater and the marine environment, etc. And we are plotting these against the sectors which are most relevant for our investment book. And we're assessing the sector's biodiversity impacts and dependencies. And it's sort of at a high level, but we're trying to work out what's the materiality. And we're assigning a kind of very, at this stage, quite simplistic rating to it. And then, and this is a point that I'm sure many will be addressing today, but we're trying to assess the location specificity of it, because obviously that's a big difference with climate when you're measuring carbon. Biodiversity, nature, it's very location specific. So we've plotted the same themes against different geographical regions. And again, we're trying to assess at a high level the materiality of these two. And this is helping us to identify where the most significant biodiversity risks are across our investment book. That's the key bit. But as I said, it's early days. We've got a lot of work to do. I think the ultimate objective is you'll have something that can really help inform our investment policies, where we're prioritizing ESG focus, integration, and crucially internal education. So quite pleased looking at the version 0.2 that, you know, our approach is along the lines that's advocated or suggested by the LEAP-FI framework. And then the last piece is we're really trying to, and this will resonate with a lot of folk listening, is we're really trying to get access to better, more relevant data, which is going to be helpful to inform our decision making. So obviously that's a key reason why we've been firm supporters of the TNFD, not quite as early as Chris, but you know, we're pleased to be part of this. It's also why we've been collaborating with CGP over the last year, helping them to develop their water framework by providing the investor perspective so that they can refine their water, apologies, the lights going out in here, to refine their water questionnaire to better target disclosure of relevant, comparable, investment decision useful water information. And lastly, we fed into the transition plan task force, asking them to consider including biodiversity cross-sectoral biodiversity in their cross-sector net zero transition pathway framework. So those are the key things.
It's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned data. Of course, that's my passion from my background. We actually launched our data catalyst yesterday. I think everyone's probably aware of that, to help encourage the data companies that are already out there. We've scanned at least 60 now in the spatial data. Some have been doing this for a long time, like Encore, some are very new. A question came in, and Annabelle, you said quite rightly, you're an asset manager and an asset owner. A question came in from Sat Palal, who owns nature? You mentioned dependencies and impacts, but I think the question puts it right, which is for too long we've sort of assumed that we can just use nature as if it's a non-exhaustible. But when you think as an asset owner, how do you think about who owns the natural systems that you depend upon?
Well, we all do, right? As individuals, as citizens, people, planet, we all do. But I mean, as an asset owner and as an asset manager, we're thinking about how do we optimize the investment performance for our clients, and how do we deliver our fiduciary duty? So that's not just about investing to maximize financial return. It's also, because we are a long-term active investors, it's about investing to achieve a planet that our policyholders, our clients, our customers want to live in and retire to. And it is very long-term. So we have to be holistic. We've got to, our responsibility is to think about those things which will impact the outside in, the impact of our investments, but also crucially, and this is the really hard bit, is assess the impact of our investments on the outside world, the inside out piece. And there are challenges, I mean, there are a vast number of challenges, but one of the biggest ones is that we are grappling with is, to a large extent, we all know that the accounting bases for recording financial performance is imperfect. That's the whole purpose of TCFD, TNFD, to get better information. The ISSB is to better account for it. So we know that the financial metrics are imperfect. They are objective, but they are broadly backward looking, whereas achieving sustainability is subjective. My priorities may be different from yours and may be different from somebody else's. It is very long dated, it's forward looking over a time horizon. There are lots of different interdependencies and it is not quantified yet. So quantifying those financial externalities, which we know are real, we can't yet do. So that's the tension that we are addressing, but we're very mindful of it. So the biggest mitigant that we can do right now is to get ourselves better informed, better understand where the risks arise, and collaborate. This is a team sport.
There's been a lot of emphasis and focus on TNFD incorporating local communities and Indigenous peoples, and the social aspect. It comes up again and again and again. I would argue that ESG hasn't had much of social before, and actually when you look at nature and biodiversity, you have to take into account local social issues. I don't know where this stat came from, but I heard that 80% of farms are less than a hectare large. That kind of compounds the challenge we have, that actually farming is a very local business. But I think it's a very interesting question that came up. But thank you very much, Annabelle. I'm going to switch gear a little bit now to the opportunity side as well of the risk dimension. We have Leo, who is the impact manager of climate asset management. Thank you for joining us, Leo. Climate asset management is the combination between pollination and HSBC, both of which have been very involved in the informal working group and members of the task force. For thank you about that. Leo, every day I seem to read about alternative proteins, vertical farming, photovoltaic integration of land. I mean, lots of new areas. This has suffered from a bit of hype, but you've put an ambition to be the world's largest dedicated natural capital asset management company. That's a very bold ambition. So you're obviously a believer in these opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about where these opportunities are, and what is the opportunity not just for financial returns, but for natural returns as well?
Yeah, thank you, David, and welcome everybody this morning. So yeah, absolutely, that's our objective. One of our sort of core aims is to make natural capital an asset class for institutional investors. And as you said, we've aimed to be the largest one dedicated purely to natural capital. And the way that we're doing this is we have two strategies. We have our natural capital strategy, which looks at OECD markets. And what we're looking to do with that is to invest in agriculture and forestry, as well as what we're terming environmental assets, where we look to generate revenues through payments for ecosystem services. And then on the other side of that, we're looking at our nature-based carbon strategy as well, which is looking to develop high integrity carbon credit projects. This is with a focus in the developing markets. And the idea of what we're aiming to do and where we see the opportunities for natural capital and for positive impacts on nature is around changing and shifting these large-scale agricultural practices from an unsustainable and extractive model to this more regenerative model that shifts away from business as usual and implements a wide range of sort of nature positive actions, as we're terming them. And fundamental to what we're doing with our strategy is to generate positive impacts, not just for nature, but also, as we've mentioned, for climate and for the communities that rely on both of these. And as it's just been covered, it's absolutely key for us to bring the communities along with us when we invest in projects and landscapes, because biodiversity and ecosystem services are simply so location specific. And it's not just us who will rely on them. So we really do put communities at the center of what we look to do. And while this is definitely our ambition, though there are a number of challenges that we face in trying to do this. And I think one of the sort of core ones is around this traditional approach to biodiversity and nature. We've always traditionally looked at biodiversity and the interaction with the private sector as something around impacts and more recently dependencies, but as a negative view of how the private sector can damage nature and how we need to mitigate and manage these impacts that we have upon it. While we think that's still a very important part of what we do, we have a management system in place at all of our assets to ensure that they do no harm to nature and to climate. What we see far less developed is the positive side. How do we start to identify and quantify the positive impacts that our assets can have if we shift the management practices upon them? And what we've seen from those who have started to do this and started to work in this space is that we tend to see some very bespoke approaches. You see individual assets having a huge list of indicators to demonstrate how they're impacting the landscape in a positive manner. And while this is very useful for them in terms of managing those projects, it can, as I think, David, you touched on at the start, be very confusing for an investor to look at this and understand and compare between different projects and assets. How do we know, an agriculture project in Europe, for example, the impact that is having compared to say a forestry project in Australia? So while that's one of the sort of the key things that we see TNFD delivering for us, and one of the key opportunities for us to engage with the TNFD is around this common framework for us to be able to communicate these opportunities to our investors and to our other stakeholders in a way that's meaningful and allows them to make informed decisions about where they want to put their money. So I think that's the really thing that we're very excited to see from the TNFD. We saw in the latest release a lot of the targets and metrics around impacts, and we look forward to the next iteration of that, where we see more about the risks and the opportunities. So we think this is fundamental to the way that we are aiming to shape our business. And I also think this is coming at a very important time as we see things like the UN Decade in Restoration. We have the CBD COP coming up in December, which will talk about and hopefully agree the global biodiversity framework. And all of these are going to be talking about the contributions the private sector can make. So that's why we're really keen to see the TNFD offering a clear pathway for us to be able to achieve this. So yeah, that's how we're sort of approaching it at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. I mean, you mentioned regenerative farming. There's a lot of discussion about soil carbon retention. how does this become investable? Is it starting to become investable? How does that actually happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things, you know, it's not a traditional approach to investing, but it is absolutely possible. It just takes a little bit more time and thought into how we can maximize the positive outcomes for a particular landscape. You know, we are looking across nature, we're looking at biodiversity, water, soil health, climate, community benefits. All of these need to be accounted for when we look at our investment opportunities. And this is a fundamental part of this, is balancing the trade-offs between them. How do we get the most sort of positive output from these projects without compromising any of the key elements? So it is that sort of structured approach of trying to look across all of these different elements and balance those trade-offs.
That's very interesting, and lots more to be discussed around the opportunity side as this happens. As you know, a lot of issues around meat and dairy and protein and the way that we produce it, and the alternatives offer both a solution that is investable and better for the planet. That would be fantastic for everyone. Well, thank you very much, Leo. So Supriya from NatWest, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to ask you a little bit about your experience of TCFD to TNFD. Obviously, NatWest is very involved in TCFD. You're very now getting more involved in TNFD. I'd love to understand what you've learned about the connection between the two. And also a follow-up question, NatWest has a very unique portfolio of you know, a lot of small farmers and larger farms as well. How will TNFD be implemented, do you think, at that sort of ground level? There's a couple of questions coming in from people about how is this actually being implemented. We don't have a farmer on our panel, but so I'm going to ask you as a lender to farmers how you think that's actually going to happen. But welcome, good morning.
Thanks, David. And I'll not pretend to be a farmer because obviously I'm not. So just from a NatWest perspective, I'll just talk through our journey on TCFD and how we will use that to implement TNFD as well. So as you mentioned right at the start or earlier just now, is TNFD isn't just about disclosures, and neither was TCFD. So we are approaching it as how can we shape our work on climate as well as nature in implementing the framework, and the disclosure piece comes out as an outcome. So in terms of where we are on TCFD, we are one of the premium listed issuers in the UK. So we published a compliance statement last year, and then we have for the last 2 years a standalone TCFD disclosure, and we now are compliant with TCFD. And in terms of the work that's going on TNFD and how we will approach the framework is firstly identification of nature-related risks and opportunities. So this isn't something that's new. We've already been doing this. So as an example, we've got an environmental, social, and ethical framework, which we use to assess customers we onboard. And that includes, say, for example, forestry, fisheries, and agribusiness policy. And that leads to prohibition or restriction of certain businesses that we won't lend to because of the types of activities they do. What the TNFD is helping us do is bring it all together and package it to help support our opportunities assessment as well as setting out strategies, which is exactly how we went about with TCFD as well. Some of the other things that are going on are we recognized last year biodiversity and nature loss as a formal emerging risk. And we want to make sure that as we are assessing customers, as we are looking at our balance sheet, we start identifying nature-related risks more formally than we have been doing so far. And that will obviously feed into the opportunities assessment as well as our strategy setting. The other piece is how do we include nature in our governance and risk management, as I mentioned. So we are looking to see how we can use the LEAP tool in terms of assessing our nature-related risks, as well as starting to assess the nature impacts or some sort of measurements on a pilot set of customers, just to start seeing how much of the risks, not only sort of qualitatively, but quantitatively do we carry, and then what sort of opportunities can we bring in to meet those. Climate obviously is a step ahead, and we will use climate and the framework and the work we have done to set nature. So the other thing we've done on climate is the measurement, obviously. So we have assessed finance emissions, so carbon per pound of lending or from an emissions per intensity perspective. And the other thing we're doing is setting up transition plans. So how do we help the UK, and how do we meet our ambitions to meet net zero? And we've been quite clear from the start that we will transition by helping our customers transition, right? And you mentioned farmers. So obviously we finance farms and agriculture customers and farmers. So we really want to work with them in terms of assessing what would be useful for them as products to support that in terms of supporting nature and changing the way they farm, changing their practices so that we can finance that and support them. We're also working with the Sustainable Food Trust, and that piece should really help in terms of both getting data from farmers, because obviously small farmers don't really produce accounts, they don't really have a lot of carbon emission calculations, etc. So how can we A, encourage them to have the data, and then B, get access to data in terms of then supporting them to move along in transition, both from a climate perspective and a nature perspective. Some of the other things that are going on and I think Annabelle mentioned in terms of this is a team sport, right? So collaboration and working together externally as well as internally is quite key. So NatWest is a really big bank. So I sit in finance, but I work on a day-to-day basis with our business teams who actually face off to our customers in finding how can we support them, both from a climate perspective and then progressively from a nature perspective. So internally, we are working towards an education roadmap. How do we spread the word around nature? How do we make it a topic that we discuss on a day-to-day basis? How do we embed nature in our decision making, just like we are doing on climate? So that's something we're doing internally. And externally as well, obviously we are engaged with TNFD. I mentioned the Sustainable Food Trust. We are members of the Principles for Responsible Banking Biodiversity subgroup, and also work with the Accounting for Sustainability. So there's a lot of linkages, and as I said, climate has sort of set apart, and we'll use that and hopefully get through onto the implementation of TNFD at a faster pace, because obviously we've done that first bit from a climate perspective. Some of the learnings and things we are experiencing, and I've seen some of the Q&A coming in as well, is on data. And I think it's been mentioned quite a few times that we have a lot of data. It's just how do we use that data and convert that into information to assess our risks, then set opportunities, but then manage those risks as well, and kind of have a record of looking back and saying, okay, this is how we were doing this, and this is how these opportunities have helped, and this is how further ahead we are. So it's not just about sort of having the data and doing some calculations. It's just how do you use that to embed in decision making, I guess is the big thing that we need to sort of move on. And I think as an industry, we need to collectively work on. So that, in a nutshell, is what we are doing and how we are using climate and linking to nature.
And it does sound like you're quite far along. As NatWest implements TCFD and then ideally TNFD, will you expect your clients to follow the TNFD and TCFD guidelines as well? Is that how that works?
So we have quite a strong engagement with our customers, and as I mentioned, as we are looking to set our own transition plan for climate, we are effectively looking at doing that through our customers' transition. So there is a lot of engagement from that perspective, and the more customers publish TCFD, the more data we have to assess our climate impact and then support them. And I will be similar on TNFD. Obviously, there are different customers, so we deal with lots and lots of customers, from an individual, from a mortgage perspective, to a very big corporate and SMEs, and as you mentioned, small farmers. So I think it just takes time for different sets of customers to get on the journey. But as we start progressing on this, and we are already making good progress, then we'll involve them as well.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll hear later from you about what you expect and think from the National Consultation Group and what's there. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in, some quite interesting, some common themes coming in around data and targets and other areas. I'm going to tackle the political elephant in the room, and maybe I'm going to ask our most political expert here, Chris, not for a political opinion, but maybe a view. With the leadership election in the UK, very, very topical right now, I haven't heard the candidates talk specifically about biodiversity, but is this a setback for the climate goals and the nature and biodiversity agenda, or what's your view, Chris, of how this plays out? Because the UK, obviously, with COP, was very forward and very proactive on the climate agenda.
Yes, great question. I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that one. I don't think we've had much chance to see what the candidates actually have as their views on detailed issues, just because of the nature of the process. I think one of the things that the outgoing PM really did was kind of grab the climate agenda and push it forward and make it a political priority. But I think, as the Committee on Climate Change commented just last week, there wasn't quite as much follow through in terms of the detail of implementation. So I guess what I'd be hoping for from a new Prime Minister is a really clear and consistent message about, commitment to the net zero, sectoral roadmaps that actually kind of deliver that in detail with policies that are going to actually attract investment into those individual sectors. And I really think there's an opportunity now to combine that with the response to the nature emergency. So what we get great, it's not very popular. It's not very popular at the moment to say let's follow the EU example. But I do think that the way that the EU has responded to the crisis in Ukraine is exemplary in terms of demonstrating that they've still got their sustainability goals at the heart of their response, saving energy, doubling down on clean energy transition, whilst also looking to diversify supplies of gas. So yeah, consistent long-term policies and an opportunity. I think it should appeal to conservative values, nature and engagement with the land. So, I think we could hope to see a little more coming from a new leader there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting view and more probably optimistic when we're in the heat of a debate at the moment, which seems to dwell on tax cuts. I'm hoping that nature, biodiversity and climate will come up the agenda. And so much of the UK's nature risk is actually imported as well. A good question here for Annabelle, actually, which is an asset manager question, putting you on the spot a bit. If an existing investment was deemed to be negative from nature, biodiversity, and let's face it, most of them probably are. There's very little that we do actually, which is not negative in some way. Would funding be removed or engagement be preferable? They've led you into the answer maybe, but I'm interested to hear your view. This is from Patrick.
Hi there. Yes. It's a very good question. It's a very apposite question because it's something that we face on a daily basis. I think let's look at it this way. Our objective as long-term investors is to be pragmatic, take a forward-looking approach to achieve real-world positive change, to make incremental steps through the way we're investing to help support that transition to sustainability, whether it's on climate, whether it's on nature, biodiversity, whether it's improving social equality, addressing all the issues. And they all have to happen. I mean, truly effective action has to happen collectively. So when we are thinking about the risks presented by an investment, as active investors, it's grounded in research. We are looking at those things which are going to affect the outside in, so the financial performance of the investment. But we do, of course, have to think about the inside out. And I don't have an absolute answer because obviously it's a case-by-case basis, but we have to take a pragmatic, balanced view of delivering the investment performance, the investment objectives that our client wants, and balancing the time horizons. That's the key thing here, is a lot of we're seeing that the effects of degradation of nature are real and they're apparent now. I mean, it's awful, but in some ways the fact that they're observable to all of us on a daily basis is also what's galvanizing the action. So everybody's, the iron filings, if you like, are all moving in the right direction, but we also have to be mindful that the time horizon for commitment, for action, is quite short. The time horizon for the full impacts of the effects may be much longer. And we have to balance the impacts for nature, climate, social and financial performance, because we're investing, we are, as asset owners, investing people's pensions, so they need money to live and they need money today and in 20 years time, whatever the liability profile is. So it's a balanced approach. I think it's a bit of a non-answer to your question in terms of if you wanted a specific answer, but it's on a case-by-case basis. It's driven in research, and this is kind of the responsibility and value of active management.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. It puts you on the spot. I have a lot of conversations with asset owners about, they say, David, what's the stranded asset of nature? what do I need? What's my coal-fired power station that I need to think of getting out of now? Plastics, meat production, deforestation. I think there are certain hot areas that we're learning. And actually several of our members have been called out by the press for investing in deforestation. So I think there are some hot areas that are really worth looking hard at. And you're right, Annabelle, you talked about the timeframes being shorter. We've actually shortened the timeframes for the TNFD approach because we've got a phrase that impacts on nature are more direct and they're more immediate. If you destroy the natural environment that you rely upon, the impact tends to hit you very quickly, versus climate where you're impacting the overall aggregate of CO2. You mentioned location being so important. There are different aspects to nature of a climate. So it's a very interesting question to ask. A lot of questions around data coming up. Some people think there's too much, some people think there's not enough. We've done a whole data scan on this. I'm going to put Leo on the spot on the data, because obviously to make positive investment models, you need a lot of data. But what's your view of where the data sets are today, and what can TNFD do to help?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really key part of this whole process. And as part of our sort of engagement through HSBC, we've been sitting on TNFD's targets and metrics working group to sort of look into this and, you know, what are the metrics we need and what data needs to underpin them in order to make them useful for us. There, as you mentioned, there is a huge amount of data out there. It's identifying which bits of it are useful for you, and how do you, as I think you know, TNFD are terming it, how do we make it decision useful? How do we get this into a format and a process that can allow us to inform our investment decisions? We are at the moment are sort of in the process of identifying exactly how we're going to demonstrate our positive impacts. We've set a number of impact objectives across our two funds. And the idea now is to go through those data sets and data providers and align them and their provisions with what can demonstrate positive impacts for us. And it will vary between our assets. We're not going to simply have a one-size-fits-all approach to this. And it will also vary depending on the stage of our investment decision as well. So at the very initial stages, we rely on a lot of global data. A lot of global data sets, such as can be available through things like IBAT, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, to screen out investments where we think they're going to have particularly negative effects on protected areas or key biodiversity areas, or whether a particularly threatened species, for example. But then as we progress through and we start to manage those assets, we then are increasingly relying on the ground data collection, which we think is very important. You know, we can't get away from this. Nature is a very local and specific thing, and it has a lot of nuance in there that you can't always rely on these easy global data sets to sort of identify. And what we're also doing is trying to explore some of the new and developing opportunities. So things like eDNA and how that might be able to streamline the process for us and have a structured approach that doesn't incur some of the time constraints and resource constraints that on the ground biodiversity surveys can do. So yeah, it's really, again, a balance of all of these different types of data that are out there. It's just finding the right fit for your particular needs. That's the challenge. And I think that's where TNFD comes in trying to identify what they are.
I would encourage people, particularly those who posted the question, to read the data paper we released, but also look at the data catalyst. One thing we found is the growth in the number of data sources. There were 1,200 low orbit spatial satellites launched in 2020. That's 5 times more than just the year before. So the amount of spatial data that is now becoming available is very high. One gap, though, is a lot of companies don't actually have asset data of either their investment portfolio or where their operations are, let alone where their what we call upstream locations are. So the data challenge actually isn't just the spatial data that's available on the ecosystems and the state of ecosystems. That's becoming more available. It's actually where the assets that you rely on or invest on that is becoming the challenge. The company that brings the two together, I think, will do very well, but that's some way off. But just a thought on the data side. But thanks for that question. It's a really important point. And Leo, you make a good point about, you know, assessing the negatives and the impacts that might happen from the data side. There's an interesting question on mortgages, very practical. I'm going to actually ask Supriya on this, because if you're lending mortgages into the household market, how do you think about a mortgage lender and the nature focus on that. We focus a lot on the equity markets and disclosures for companies. We don't necessarily focus enough, and we need to, on the debt side as well. But as a large mortgage lender, I'd put you on the spot on this one before I turn to everyone for a quick summary.
I'll probably not answer that fully, but in terms of, I think we need to, and then this is where collecting the right data is correct, right? So from a climate perspective, we are using energy efficiency or EPC certificates as a proxy in terms of how much carbon the property is consuming, and we're using that to calculate emissions. I think we'll need to figure out what the right metric is from a nature perspective, and whether we continue to use EPC and then use that to assess, or there's also a lot of, as part of our physical risk assessment, we do have data from by postcode in terms of where the property is located, and other kind of useful data sets. So I think we'll probably use some of those in terms of assessing nature-related risk from a mortgage perspective.
So maybe if there's a new estate being built in a land of very
Exactly.
sensitive biodiversity, then that would be a red flag for...
Yeah, but we also finance commercial real estate, right? So developers. So I think, and this is where we need to look at sectors as part of a system rather than in silos. And that's what we're trying to do from a climate perspective, as well as where up the chain could we start looking at this rather than once the home is built. So is it at the commercial real estate stage?
Very good point. We've had some fantastic work by one of our members is Holcim, one of the largest producers of concrete and manufacturing materials for buildings. And of course, concrete as cement and use of water, there's a whole very interesting area around how building work and construction can help be more nature positive than it is today. A couple of questions have come in that I'll just take. There's a couple of questions about targets, science, SBTN. Yes, we have a partnership with SBTN. We're working very closely with them. As many people have said, TNFD is at this place where TCFD was when it first started. It didn't have the 1.5 degree target. The targets for nature will be more complex. There's not going to be a simple 1.5 degree. Elizabeth, my co-chair, chairs the CBD. As you've just seen, the meeting that was going to be in China has been moved to Montreal for December. So it's a very, very important meeting where she is trying to bring together with her secretariat 170 countries to agree on global, local, and national targets for nature. So it's great to have her as my co-chair, because we're obviously then very closely aligned to that process and that important part of setting targets for nature, which is very complex, much more complex than it is for climate. So we are working closely and have a partnership with both CBD as they develop the global biodiversity framework and the SBTN. One other question came in about Asia and national consultation groups. We do have one in Australia that is going out to Asia Pac, and we are looking at other national consultation groups. If you want to contact the secretariat, very happy to do that. But I would like to thank the panel. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thank everyone for the questions coming in. We will try and take these offline and answer them. There's too many here to give justice to do that. But as a wrap up, I'm going to ask each of you for just one sentence of what are you looking for TNFD, and particularly the UK National Consultation Group, to achieve for your business over the next 12 months. So in one very short sentence, just to wrap up. Chris?
So I think that the TNFD has been exemplary in the transparency and the development of the framework, but what I think it really needs now is a safe space to allow all of us who are working on this to collaborate, to validate our conclusions, and to kind of adjust our approaches. The UK focus provides a really good opportunity to link it directly to UK policy and to people that are acting in the real economy, as well as the investors that you've heard about today. But also I think this interaction with other people that are doing similar work. So on metrics, the Climate Financial Risk Forum's got stuff you can learn from. On opportunities, we heard about climate asset management, the Natural Capital Investment Alliance. And on location, I actually think we can take a lot from what's being done on physical climate risk. So it's that chance to bring that all together, but with a focused outcome of the TNFD.
Thanks. Very, very good, Chris. Very comprehensive. And I think your point about safe space engagement is very key. So Annabelle from Energy.
Yeah, Chris, you made the points I would make. There's one in addition, which is, the role of the finance sector is the efficient allocation of capital. What is really imperative in this great initiative is that we have alignment of policy and regulation so that we have the right things being efficient from a financial perspective. We need a sort of joined up approach, and we need to look at both what is produced but also what is consumed, because ultimately it's actions and behaviours, us as financiers, you as corporates, all of us as individuals, that needs to be aligned and needs to be changed.
Thank you. Alignment, really important, mention of collaboration. Supriya?
I think from my perspective as a user of the framework and implementation, it's, as Chris said, providing that safe space and practical tools and help in terms of implementing TNFD as a framework, not just for disclosure, but implementing it in our business and business models, etc. And the second piece is consistency on metrics and measurement. So for emissions, we are kind of slowly having a couple of sort of standards to follow, but I would like to see that coming out as to just so that as we are starting, we all start with the same endpoint rather than going in different directions and changing approaches.
Very important for comparability in particular. And then last but not least, Leo.
Yeah, so from our perspective, what we're really looking forward to is this opportunity side and the development of that part of the framework. I think that's going to be really key for us to start to frame and communicate natural capital as an asset class in its own right. And from the UK Consultation Group, I'd really just encourage everyone to pick this up and to try it for your business. You know, one of the key strengths of TNFD is that it's a market-led, consensus-based approach, and that only works if people trial it and then are very frank about the benefits and the challenges that they face in implementing it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leo. I didn't put you up to say that, but I agree with you entirely. So a quick summary: safe space. It's not just about disclosures, it's about engagement, location. It's about risk and opportunity, and you have to engage community. So I think that's very, very good summary from our panelists. Thank you very much for your contribution to both the TNFD to today and also the UK National Consultation Group. What I want to do now is hand over to the person who's actually going to help organize the work and do the work. Helen Avery, who is the head of nature programs at GFI. Helen's been involved in TNFD from the outset. So thank you, Helen, for all of your brilliant work. She's going to lead the National Consultation Group. So Helen is now going to hand over to say, okay, we've talked about the why, we've talked about the what, how are we going to actually do this? What are the things we're going to put in place? Helen, thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much. Yeah, and just before we wrap up, we thought, well, we should tell you about what the plans are for the National Consultation Group and how you can start to engage. You know, we are your group and we want to be as supportive as we can, and you can tell us the best way to do that. So I'm just going to encourage you in the next 3 minutes or so to post questions in the Q&A function, and I'll address those if I can. If you have comments beyond what we just heard the panel say they'd like to see out the NCG, we'd love you to put those comments in the chat, and we'll take those away and capture those ideas. So as Rhian mentioned, the role of the National Consultation Group, which I may refer to as the NCG, is one, we want to understand the national concerns around nature-related risks and opportunities. So that means we'll be engaging across sectors, not just financial institutions and corporates, but across sector, and we want to hear from you about that. So August will be having a big engagement strategy, reaching out to lots of you, and feel free to do the same. I'll leave my email at the end, will be posted in the chat. The second is really to socialise the draft TNFD framework across the UK. We were very lucky to be joined on the panel today by 4 financial institutions. We were going to have a couple of UK corporates, but unfortunately COVID struck, and we were very lucky that other financial institutions stepped in. But I will say that the engagement with the TNFD in the UK so far has been really, we've seen a lot of enthusiastic response from the financial sector, which is fantastic. A little less so with UK corporates. So really want to sort of socialise the TNFD with UK corporates in addition to financial institutions. And we'll also be supporting the testing and piloting for practitioners. And I'll talk a bit more about a couple of events that we'll run to help you with that. And then we want to get your feedback. As David says, it's really important that we get your feedback on the draft framework to ensure that the final framework can be readily applied by organisations in the UK. It won't take the place of the portal. There's an amazing portal. I think Phoebe's going to post a link to that in the chat, where you can offer your feedback on the framework, and I suggest that you have a look at that. But what we can do, of course, as people have mentioned today, is provide a safe space to share among peers. So you can tell us what you think, and we'll capture those ideas and feed it directly back into the framework as well. We think it's important that we sort of go sector by sector and offer sort of closed door events where you can feel sort of, as I say, more able to sort of share. I'll talk a bit more in a moment about the other groups who will be hosting similar events that they'll feed in to us, the NCG. So our goal, as I mentioned, is we want to reach as many companies as possible and hear from as many of you as possible. Today's event is obviously a public event to let everyone know just what to expect from the NCG and to begin this socialisation of the TNFD in the UK. But we are going to be hosting a lot more targeted events, as I said. So in September, we'll host an event where you can come and learn about how to pilot, and we'll hear from those who are piloting. There are several piloting in the UK right now, Barclays, Phoenix Group, Tesco, BP, all piloting here, among many others. In autumn, we'll also host the first of the feedback events where you can start to provide feedback to the TNFD team and ourselves directly after you've had a bit more time to digest the latest release as well. As David mentions, there's going to be a further release we heard about in November. Some of these events will be open, as mentioned, and some will be closed doors. So we also want to hear from you. If you want sector-specific closed door events, we can help you with those. We know that there are many trade bodies and member associations hosting their own workshops for their members, or who are starting to work with their members on nature-related risks and opportunities, such as the City of London, UK Finance, UK CIF, UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, BBF, the CBI, IEMA, and many, many more. And thank you to those organisations for your support and for sharing today's event. Absolutely vital in providing this channel of feedback, and we're really looking forward to partnering with you to ensure that that feedback from members is being fed directly into the TNFD, and we'll be obviously carrying on our discussions with you in the next few weeks to see how best we can do that. So what do you need to do before I go? If you, by signing up to today's event, and if you opted in, you'll now receive our monthly newsletter, which will keep you informed on TNFD updates, UK-related news around nature-related risks and opportunities, as well as public events. You can, of course, opt out at any time. In addition, and for those who might listen to this recording, it said, if you are a UK member of the TNFD Forum, you're automatically signed up for the UK National Consultation Group, and you'll be receiving notifications of all the upcoming practitioner, like closed door events as well. And if you're not a member of the TNFD Forum, we really encourage you to join. That's sort of the easiest way for us to sort of collect people into the National Consultation Group. And you can join by filling out a form on the TNFD Forum page. That link is available on the GFI Hive TNFD website page. Again, that link should be in the chat now. So if you're a practitioner hoping to join events, we really would love you to join the TNFD Forum. It hosts its own education events, it hosts all the release events. We work obviously closely with that team as we host the secretariat, and we're working on the UK NCG with them. So I would recommend also, when you do that, just to email me and let me know that you're joining, so I have your details and make sure that nothing's been missed off and that you are going to get cited on all of the work we're doing. My email should also be in the chat. It's helen.avery@gfi.green. You can contact me anytime if you have any questions on the TNFD. It's what we're here for, and we want to be supportive. And as mentioned, we will be beginning to reach out to you in the coming weeks. So I'm going to just pause there and just quickly check comments and questions in case I have any that have come through. It's one here. If you're relatively new to the TNFD and its documents, is it wise to start at the beginning discussion papers, or if we delve into version 2, will it catch us up? I would recommend going and looking back through what's come before, especially the LEAP process. But I think it's helpful, as David mentioned, there's a lot of reports on the site. You'll be able to get through them, I would think, pretty quickly to get you up to speed with version 2. There's also, if you join the TNFD Forum, it's not hard to do. You fill in a form and say who you're representing. You'll get access to all the former videos as well, so you can also use those to catch up. Just see if there are any. How do I access the portal? Hopefully that it's framework.tnfd.global. It should be in the chat, that link. And I think that's all I'm seeing. I'm just going to check the chat. Thanks, Mark, for your comment. Obviously, Mark represents UK BBF. There are other sort of co-leads, but he is your main man if you want to contact him about getting involved there. So thank you all for your time today. Feel free to email me anytime with any questions, more questions you've had that maybe we didn't get to today. There will be a recording of this session that will be posted on the GFI Hive website under events and the TNFD page. So you'll be able to see it there or share it. And until the next event, just thank you again for coming and for all your support, and really look forward to working with you in the months ahead. Thanks.